Okay, here I've got the Vero shutter, the one from the camera that you've seen taken apart. And here I've got the Pronto shutter from the other camera. So I'll pull these two shutters down side by side and you'll see that there's very little difference between them. I'm going to start by removing the ring from the front of the lens here, the focus scale ring. Now, when you put the camera back together, I normally use a ground glass screen at the film plane and use that to work out where the infinity position should be. But assuming that the camera focused correctly before you took it apart, you've only got to put things back where they were and you won't have any problems at all. So how would you go about doing that? Well, first thing I'll do is I'll remove, this is sitting at the infinity position now. You'll see that that is right here, that lines up pretty much at the end of the letter A there, between the A and the C, closer to the end of the A. So I'll just note that fact. I'll remove these three tiny grub screws. These are coming loose very easily, by the way. They're not always as easy as that. They don't have to be backed out all the way. I can lift off the name ring. Then back where we were, with our infinity mark here, and I've taken note where it was. It's right on the end of that letter A right there. In fact, I can probably put a tiny little tick mark there to let me know. That'll be covered by the name ring, so no one's ever going to know. Now, how do we know that we've got that back in the same place when we put the shutter together? Well, this isn't a multi-start thread, it's only a single start thread. So if I roll that right round until it stops, until it's bottomed in the thread, that gives me a reference point. So let's see how far we go. Okay, it only went to there. It went to this point. I'll put a little mark there. It was bottomed out. So we know that if we screw this lens in home when we're reassembling things, then back it up until our line is aligned here, put the focus ring back on set to infinity, all will be good. It saves you having to use a ground glass screen. Of course, you don't have the assurance that your focus is good. You're counting on the focus having been correct beforehand, but there's every likelihood it was correct beforehand. So, in from here, I'll gather these pieces up, put them aside. So the front lens group just unscrews. Well, the front lens element really. These are a triplet. The middle one, that's held into the shutter with a ring that is actually bonded with a touch of lacquer most likely. But the lens glass itself, that glass element, is also cemented into the shutter. So leave it alone. If you try and remove that, there's a very high chance you'll actually break it. Now you can clean it in place, there's no reason to have to remove it from the shutter. So in from here, what do we want? Well, this screw here, a half head screw, we can rotate that. It's not actually a screw, it's a rivet. It's got a slot in it. Rotate it so that the flat side is against your indentations here. And then we've got to unscrew this retaining ring. Now you can use the tip of your screwdriver. You run the risk of scarring up the metal. You can use the tip of the tweezers in the same fashion with the same risks. Let's see how tight this is first. Very tight. I'm going to get a bamboo skewer and see if that'll move that. Yeah, well the skewer's not holding up all that well, but it is turning it. Let me just take the tip off that. Right. So I'll unscrew this. It's quite stiff. I can see dried grease around here. It might be worth putting a drop of naphtha on there to soften that dried grease. It's gone like a lacquer. I'll get the naphtha. And when I worked at Kodak, they did have a tool which would engage these retaining rings, but it would be a lot of fun making one. Far beyond my machinist's capabilities, that's for sure. Okay, find a pair of tweezers. Let's find the correct tweezers. Here's our retaining ring. Now these are thin and they're only made out of aluminium, so they're easily distorted. Be quite careful with them, because otherwise, if you make a mess of that, you'll never get the thing screwed back down. So in from here, we've got the front nameplate here. Then this ring, this is the shutter speed settings cam plate, if you like. Here we've got a spring detent to give us our click stops. Over here you'll see the settings on the retard gear train, which control how far the retard gear train can swing inwards or outwards. Let's take this off. And we're into the shutter. Right, now I'm going to do exactly the same for the Pronto shutter beside me, and we'll compare them side by side. Well, here you see the two shutters side by side, the Vero here and the Pronto here. And as you can see, they look identical, with the exception of the self-timer or delay action, which is only present in the Pronto. The shutter housings look identical, but where the Pronto has a little cutout here that arm runs through, here the cutout is present in the casting but not in the trim plate on the outside. But otherwise those shutters look the same. So I'll put the Pronto aside for a second. We'll carry on with the Vero shutter. And I'll just start taking this to pieces. At the back of the shutter, I'm going to remove the retaining ring that I put on there to save it getting lost, and its related shims. Let's have a look at this. Now the rear lens group, this piece is screwed in and retains the glass lens. There's no huge point in removing that. You're only likely to risk damaging your lens. You could if you wanted to. That rear glass can be cleaned on the shutter body. There's no special need to remove that. Now to remove this outer ring here on the back from the shutter, there are 3 small screws around the perimeter, and there's this pin on the arm here which we may or may not be able to lift that over. Let's get that. Now I can see there's a contact spring on the back of that shutter there. That is the earth connection for the flash. I'm not sure that's present on all those shutters. So it doesn't ring a bell, no. I don't know if I can get that to come loose from there. I'm sure I can if I twist it. No, it's not coming out today. Okay, we'll ignore that. Let's remove these 3 screws. They're quite fine thread on these screws. If I was guessing, I'd say they're about 1.3 or 1.4 millimetre. Okay, let's see if this ring will lift off for us. Doesn't look like I can get it past that pin no matter what I do. Is that shutter in the cocked position? No, it isn't. No, that pin is just obstructing me. I'm going to have to remove the pin first. Okay. So the pins aren't tapered, the pins are parallel. They've got a rough spot in the middle of them, which a crimp mark, so that when they're pushed in, they stay in. Of course, they went in from one side and not the other. We don't know which way they went in. I'm going to use a pair of pliers, see if I can push that pin through. Doesn't want to go that way. It went that way. These pins are fairly easily mutilated, particularly if someone's driven them in with a hammer or chewed the ends of them up with their pliers too much. They can be difficult to get out. So back to this anyway. We should lift this off the shutter here now. Where's the spring? Oh, it's just caught on something there. There we go. There's a spring here which gives us a detent, and that was just caught in the groove. You can see this is quite dirty in here. That would make that quite stiff to move the settings. And the shutter's looking a bit more stripped down from the back now. Okay, so we can remove some of these internal components. You'll see that the main cam here, this piece here, that's held on with a retainer, a C-clip or an E-clip. Now I would encourage you to leave that on there. Don't take that off and remove this arm, because getting the spring back in place is very difficult because it has quite a pronounced amount of set on it, and it's really awkward to get it back in position. This piece gives us our detents, and that engages with these notches and the shutter speed settings cam plate. So we'll remove the screw from that. Before I remove the screw completely, I'll unhook that spring so that it's not under tension and doesn't fling this across the room. Just start another container to put my pieces in. Our speed train here. I'm going to cock the shutter first. Well, it is cocked in this case. And what that does is it allows this arm to swing back on the speed train, or would do, if it wasn't sticking. Yeah, so the speed train here is jammed. Let's just cock this. This should move easily, and it's not moving. I'm just winding that down manually by shifting the gear. What I'm trying to do here is uncover this screw. This speed train, this retard gear train, is held by 2 screws. A tall post in this position and a more normal looking screw in this position. And that's very tight. Now take note of what these screws look like. See, that one's a post. Now this should come out. These are a bit awkward to lift out because it swings back underneath there, but if you give it a push it'll come out. And there's our speed train. Now our speed train here is moving freely enough now, but it was jammed before, wasn't working at all. That'll need to be cleaned in some naphtha. I'll probably do that in the ultrasonic cleaner. But you can do it just as you can do it reasonably well, just manually, just by immersing it in some naphtha, usually in the bottom of a tiny jar, and then just working the action repeatedly, and then pulling it out and blowing out all the naphtha and contaminants, and you're good. Okay, so further on with this, right, here that screw holds that little lever down. Now that little lever works our flash thing. Our flash contact, little brass screw. There's the lever. There's a little standoff here, a little bush. And here's our flash contact, which should lift out with a bit of luck. Yeah, it did. What else have we got here? This spring here. This spring can be unhooked from behind that lever. Watch it doesn't fly away, and you can remove the screw that holds it in place. Now it's a shoulder screw so that the spring can revolve around that shoulder. And there's our spring. The job of that spring, it's a pre-tension, if you like, a preload. It keeps the shutter blades fully closed unless the main spring is pushing them open, which means that you don't end up with a gap in the middle of your shutter because the things are flopping about. Okay, well that's all looking pretty good. We'll release the shutter, and I'm going to split this from the back now. Generally, you won't need to remove this componentry here. If it was really gummed up with grease or something, or if it was rusty, then certainly that can be taken apart. Today I don't need to. That can stay where it is. So from the back, we've got 4 screws. 3 of these screws are identical. One of them comes right through at this point. The end of the screw as it comes out, that's the post that detent spring hooks around. So we'll get these screws out. Now it's not uncommon for someone to mark the shutter at the back so they know where the long screw went. It goes here actually, we can put a little mark there, put a little L, so you know that's where the long screw went. It saves you having to tip the thing over and look and figure it out. I'll show you the difference between the lengths of those screws. That's what 3 of the screws look like. That's what the longest screw looks like. If you were to put the long screw where it shouldn't be, it potentially could cause you grief because it might well come up through the mechanism plate somewhere where you wouldn't want it to be. Our 4th screw here. Now holding down on that post, I'm going to lift this case off the mechanism. It's pretty sticky in there. Yeah, okay, that came off easily. Now look at the positions of your blades. Now these blades I think are all identical. They're stacked in a certain order. So what you can do is you can mark them. You can see this is the 5th blade, the one that went on last. Underneath it the 4th, underneath that the 3rd, underneath that the 2nd, underneath this one the 1st. So normally I just would put a little scratch mark, 1 tick mark against number 1. 2 tick marks against number 2, and so on. Roman numerals for 4 and Roman numerals for 5. And those shutter blades can be lifted off, or they can be just tipped off, because we'll deal with those. Now you'll notice they didn't exactly fall off easily. Probably means they're a little bit oily. Be a bit cautious with these, particularly this one. This one here, which is blade number 3, where that sits, that tail of that blade sits into a little cutout in this piece of brass. So you have to lower this blade into position. I'll show you now. You'll be able to see it when I put the shutter back together. But basically you lift it in at this angle and hook it into place. And it drops in nicely. But that's the secret with that one. There's actually a slot. Let's pop these blades down. There's a little slot in this brass bush there. Alright, this piece here, this is the blade actuating ring. You can see in this case there's a little bit of corrosion on here. That's reasonably unusual. You don't strike that very often. And this is held down with 5 screws, and they've got washers on them. Now 2 of the washers are fairly small, the other 3 are larger. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure. But you can take note of that. We had a small washer where that post was, and one over here. Now these I'm putting to one side. Those washers are very thin. The screw heads form the pivots for the shutter blades to rotate around. That being the case, you don't want to mutilate them. So a bit of care and attention when you're undoing them is good. Let's get that washer. They're very thin, those washers. Okay, so that's all the washers out of the way. And here, now the shutter's not tensioned at this point. It's just tension that. You can put something through the hole and then rotate this. And that lever should drop in. Or was it not dropping in? I've got something here wrong. That's better. Now this is sprung loaded, the tip on this little arm is sprung loaded, and that's holding a pin on this blade actuating ring in place. So if I just flick that back, the blade actuating ring can drop out. The blade actuating ring drops out, and this corrosion I'll need to clean that up with a bit of Brasso or something before we put that back. And here's the mechanism plate stripped. It's a little bit dusty. Nothing there of note. I can see that there's a little bit of fungus possibly on that lens. Will need to be cleaned. So now I want to clean all these components, get rid of any old grease, particularly in here in the lens tube. that thread there is filled with dirty, old, dried out yellow grease. Around the outside where their front retaining ring goes on, much the same. Apart from that, it's reasonably clean. Be aware of tiny springs like this one here, which acts against this arm to provide spring tension to keep it in contact with the blade actuating ring. You don't want to catch a cotton bud or a cloth or anything on that while you're cleaning things, otherwise it'll cause you problems. Okay, so that part of the mechanism plate is all in pieces. Here we come to the diaphragm. Now this retainer plate is held in here with 2 screws. You need to take note of where everything is here. We'll put this in the fully open position for the blades. This is a bit sticky, those blades don't really want to move. This is a bit gummed up. So we'll remove those 2 screws. Now take note of how this thing's lined up. There's lots of cutouts on this plate. There's only fits in the 2 screws going in 2 positions, and the pin here is for our flash contact. If I make a tiny scratch on that plate, we'll know that the plate went back there. I'll transfer that mark to the other side of this plate when we're done, so we can see it from both sides. So take out those 2 tiny screws. We can lift the plate off. There you see our diaphragm blades and the moving plate underneath them that swings them back and effectively makes them pivot around these points. The blades are all interleaved, of course, so there's no first or last blade, so we don't need to worry about the positions of those blades. And the blades are all identical. And here's the plate that swings backwards and forwards to adjust the positions of them. You'll notice there's a big cutout on one edge. Now that cutout lines up with that hole, and that hole in turn lines up with the main post on the back of the mechanism plate. So it's pretty hard to get that wrong. Well, you get it wrong, you won't like it, put it that way. So these parts I can see in here, and I'm sure you can see that. This is very, very dirty in there. Now that's grease and dust and rubbish that it's picked up. Now none of that should be present and all needs to be cleaned away. So that is our Vero shutter. Let's have a quick look at this Pronto. Is there anything different on this that you're going to want to know about? Well, obviously we've got this retard gear train. So let's get that off. This is in the run down position. If that arm was in this direction, that would mean it was cocked. Now the spring sits over a post here on the mechanism plate. So I'm going to get my tweezers in the second to last coil here if I can. And unhook that spring. I want to get this unhooked from the other end here really. Yeah, that's it. And get that spring out of the way. Now if I cock this arm around slightly, there's a flat spot on the arm around this position. So if I swing this around until that flat spot or that cutout is lined up with the centre of here, I'll be able to lift this out of the shutter without any fights. So that's our speed train, or our self-timer for the Pronto. I better not get these pieces mixed up. I want each shutter in its own bin here. So let's have a quick look at those mechanism plates, see if there's anything different about them. Right, so on the Pronto there is actually a post here that self-timer sits on. It's not present on the Vero shutter, they didn't bother to fit it. I'm a bit surprised by that. I thought it would have been easier for them to run them down the production line identical, apart from the pieces that weren't needed. But it's certainly missing a post there. You couldn't convert that Vero to a Pronto without replacing that pin there for if you wanted to do that. Okay, that's interesting. So that's our Pronto shutter. This is a cleaner shutter than the other one. I'll strip this down in the same way, but I don't expect it to give us any problems. It's all looking quite good. I'll pop that over there with its bits and pieces. And think about the clean-up process. I'll start with the case, I think. Now all of this, the case is going to be needed to be cleaned with some naphtha and a cotton bud to get it all clean. And while I'm doing that, I'll keep away from the glass as much as possible, because I don't want to contaminate the glass with grease, because then it's much harder to clean it. Once I've got the case clean to my satisfaction, I'll come back and clean the glass. Because when we put this back together, that glass surface on the inside will be inaccessible, because it'll be sandwiched between the case and the element which is on the mechanism plate, because we're not removing that either. Okay, some cleaning work.